It smelled like furniture, not war. In a dim, rain-slicked hangar outside Hamburg, German engineers in stained white coats gathered around the wreck of the British bomber they had been ordered to study. Under harsh floodlights, the captured Mosquito lay disassembled on trestles, its pale wooden panels looking absurdly domestic, like something stolen from a carpentry shop and dropped into a battlefield. They had been told this was the fastest bomber in British service, a machine that could outrun Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs at full throttle. This sounded like a bad joke. In the age of jets, high-octane fuel, and all-metal airframes, a wooden bomber belonged in a museum, not in their nightmares. Dr. Karl-Heinz Henkel, senior materials analyst from the Luftwaffe Ministerium, adjusted his spectacles and rapped his knuckles against one of the panels. The sound was not the sharp ring of metal, but a dull, resonant thud like knocking on a coffin. "It is plywood," he murmured, disbelief creeping into his voice. A few technicians snickered. "The English must have run out of aluminum," one muttered. "They expected splinters and sawdust, not the weapon that had humiliated their air defenses for nearly 2 years." Yet as the smell of phenolic resin, sharp, sweet, almost like scorched varnish, clung to their clothes and throats, the laughter began to fade. They catalogued each component with surgical precision. No rivets, no weld seams. Every panel had been bonded, not bolted. The joints were so flawless, they reflected light, like polished stone. When Henkel tried to lever apart 2 laminated layers with a chisel, the blade snapped. This was no carpenter's glue. Under his magnifier, the fibers looked fused, like living tissue wood turned into something else. Craftsmanship seeped from every curve. The Mosquito had been built like a violin, layer by layer, tone by tone. By midnight, surrounded by sawdust, sketches, and cold coffee, Henkel stared at his calculations. The numbers would not lie for him. This toy wooden airplane had achieved speeds their finest metal bombers could only chase. Somehow, wood had defeated steel. He looked at the pale arc of a wing root, glowing under the lamps, and whispered the only question that mattered now. How? To understand how a wooden ghost could haunt the dreams of German engineers, you have to return to a very different room, years earlier, when the idea still sounded like madness. In 1938, as Europe quietly sharpened its knives for another mechanized war of steel, a tall, composed man named Geoffrey de Havilland stood before the British Air Ministry with blueprints that looked like a provocation. He unfolded his drawings on a polished table, the paper crackling softly in a room crowded with uniforms and skepticism. His bomber, he explained, would have no defensive guns, no clusters of turrets, no armor plate cocooning nervous gunners. It would carry only 2 men in a tightly drawn cockpit, smooth as a bullet. And most outrageous of all, he said it would be built almost entirely of wood. The officials listened with a polite patience reserved for cranks and geniuses. Before they decide which one you are, they waited for the joke. When it did not come, they dismissed the design with a weight of doctrine. Metal was the future. Wood was the past. Spreadsheets and specifications told them so. But de Havilland did not flinch. He understood something that did not show up on their charts. Speed itself could be armor. If you were too fast to catch, you did not need guns. If you were too light to lumber, you did not need thick skins of metal. At the same time, Britain was already feeling the strain that the bureaucrats preferred not to stare at too closely. Aluminum, the lifeblood of Spitfires, Hurricanes, and the new Lancasters, was disappearing into furnaces as quickly as it could be refined. Every gleaming fighter in the sky represented metal that could not be spared for anything else. De Havilland looked at the numbers and saw not catastrophe, but an opening. His company had spent years mastering wooden construction in light aircraft and racing planes. Across Britain, in quiet towns and factory districts, there were small workshops owned by cabinet makers, piano builders, furniture craftsmen, men who knew how to coax strength and grace out of planks and veneers, but who had no place in a war of metal. What if, he thought, their hands could build something faster, lighter, and quieter than any all-metal bomber could ever be? In his drawings, the future took shape in layers. Birch plywood for strength, Ecuadorian balsa at the core, for feather-light volume. The two married by a new kind of glue, an adhesive, stronger than nails, stronger even than bolts. Instead of a maze of ribs and rivets, the fuselage would be a laminated monocoque shell, the skin doing the work of the skeleton. It was a technique borrowed from furniture, from chairs and cabinets, from bent wood frames and molded veneers. De Havilland simply pushed it into the sky. Every kilogram saved in armor could be traded for speed. Every turret not fitted was drag avoided. His bomber would not stand and fight. It would never be there to shoot at. When war finally broke in 1939, reality crashed down with the force of falling bombs. The Air Ministry ordered traditional bombers, heavy, gunned, armored fortresses that could give as good as they got on paper. At least, de Havilland's wooden dream seemed to evaporate in the smoke. But wars devour certainties along with cities, and the day would come when Britain had so little left that even impossible ideas would be dragged back from the wastebasket and given one last, desperate look. By 1940, the comfortable certainties of pre-war doctrine had burned in the fires over London. France had fallen. The Luftwaffe prowled British skies. The Blitz turned streets into rubble and glass. In those desperate months, the Air Ministry found itself staring at inventories that no longer added up. Aluminum stocks were dwindling. Traditional bombers were being torn from the sky faster than they could be replaced. The big metal fortresses the bureaucrats had believed in were coming home cratered, or not coming home at all. And into that chaos, Geoffrey de Havilland returned with his ridiculous idea. This time, his pitch sounded very different. He was not just proposing a strange wooden aircraft. He was offering a way to build it without stealing a single sheet of aluminum from the fighters that guarded Britain's breathing space. His Mosquito, he argued, could be assembled in furniture, factories, piano works, cabinet shops, places that the war planners barely thought about. He was not asking them to believe in wood. He was asking them to accept arithmetic. Reluctantly, grudgingly, they agreed to one prototype. Just one. Under grey Hertfordshire skies that autumn, the first Mosquito began to take shape at Hatfield. The factory no longer smelled like pure aviation. It smelled like a joiner's workshop, invaded by chemistry. Piano builders from London sanded the long, elegant wings, their fingers reading the grain like sheet music. Violin makers traced the curves of the nose, shaping it with the same care they once reserved for instruments that would sing in concert halls. Furniture craftsmen laminated panels over massive concrete molds, bending wood in ways no cabinet would ever demand. At the heart of this strange creation was the glue, phenylformaldehyde resin, born in laboratory glassware, refined in furniture research labs, was now being brushed and spread between thin layers of birch and balsa. Under heat and pressure, it hardened into something amber-like, something that was no longer simply wood. The Mosquito's skin was a composite. Decades before that word would become fashionable, light, resilient, and far stronger than anyone who sniffed at plywood could imagine. The fuselage was made in two great halves, left and right, each molded like a giant wooden shell. When the resin was spread and the forms were clamped, the halves cured into smooth, seamless strength. No internal bracing webs of metal, no forests of rivets, just a hollow, stiff, aerodynamic pod, waiting to be given engines and purpose. On November 25, 1940, the prototype, painted in training yellow, rolled onto the runway at Hatfield. It looked almost too delicate, too refined, a racer masquerading as a bomber. Geoffrey de Havilland's own son, Geoffrey Jr., climbed into the cockpit. The ground crew stepped back. The Merlin engines coughed, then roared to life, twin lines of power trembling through the wooden frame. The aircraft seemed to quiver like a living thing held on a leash. As it began its takeoff run, observers expected a long, lumbering struggle into the air. Instead, the Mosquito leapt forward as if unburdened by gravity. The wheels skimmed, left the ground, and within seconds it was climbing steeply, the yellow shape shrinking against the winter clouds. At altitude, the instruments spoke the language. The Air Ministry understood. Best. Numbers. Speed, climbing past 390 miles per hour, faster than the frontline Spitfires, faster than any fighter then in service. On the ground, the men with clipboards and doubts fell silent. A wooden plane had just outflown metal, myth, and expectation in a single afternoon. That night, as the prototype cooled under its hangar lights, de Havilland walked between the half-finished frames, laying a hand on a still warm laminated panel. The smooth surface hummed with possibility. Out of scarcity and sawdust, out of chemistry and craftsmanship, something impossible had taken flight. The world would never look at wood the same way again. When the Mosquito finally traded test fields for combat, it carried no guns, no gunners, and no illusions. It went to war, armed with mathematics and faith in its own speed. The first operational squadrons that received the strange wooden bomber in 1941 stared at it with a mix of awe and unease. Pilots who were used to lumbering Blenheims and Wellingtons now found themselves assigned to something that looked more like a racing plane than a conventional bomber, slim, graceful, almost fragile. Inside, there was room for just two men, pilot and navigator, shoulder to shoulder, in a cockpit barely wider than their combined shoulders. No rear gunner, no man in a turret watching their backs, no armor plate between them and the jagged black puffs of flak waiting over enemy soil. The flight manual's philosophy could be summarized in one brutal line. If intercepted, do not fight run. Keep the Merlins at full throttle, trust the laminates and the glue, and let speed be your shield. At Boscombe Down, official tests had clocked the Mosquito close to 400 miles per hour, a figure that made statisticians blink and fighter commanders jealous. On paper, the aircraft was faster than any operational fighter in the Luftwaffe's inventory. But paper could not tell you if a wooden bomber could survive a sky full of guns. That answer would come only in the cold air over occupied Europe. Its baptism came on September 20, 1941, from the airfield at Swanton-Morley, a formation of Mosquitoes from No. 105 Squadron thundered into the sky for their first daylight raid over Oslo. The target was precise and symbolic, the Gestapo headquarters, the black heart of occupation. At 50 feet above the North Sea, they skimmed the waves, their wooden wings slicing through spray and mist, their propellers chewing the air just above the whitecaps. To anyone watching from a ship, they would have looked like mirages, pale, fast, gone, almost before they were seen. By the time German radar picked them up, the Mosquitoes were already closing in on their target. The bombs fell, concrete shuddered, and before defenses could properly respond, the wooden bombers were turning back toward the sea. Fighters scrambled from Stavanger, but they never closed the gap. On the ground, Witnesses spoke of a ghostly roar, followed by silence, as if the attackers had simply vanished into the sky. Every Mosquito returned to base unscathed. The boldness escalated. In January 1943, a pair of Mosquitoes streaked into Berlin airspace in broad daylight, a place that had long been considered too dangerous for unescorted bombers. Sirens howled across the city, not for a 1,000-plane raid, but for 2 unarmed aircraft racing above the rooftops. They dropped their bombs with surgical precision and streaked away, while German fighters clawed at the sky behind them. In a conference room below, Hermann Göring's pride absorbed the impact as much as the city's stone. He took it personally, and he was right to. Back in their squadrons, Mosquito crews began to sense that they were flying something different from any other aircraft in the war. At low level, the laminated wooden frame seemed to dance above the flak bursts, flexing instead of shuddering apart. The wood absorbed vibrations that would have rattled metal to pieces. Even when shrapnel chewed into the skin, fires were rarer, less aluminum to spark, less exposed metal to flash. Pilots spoke of the Mosquito as if it were alive, a machine that bent under pressure and then sprang back, eager to keep going. The legends grew quickly. British newspapers dubbed it the Wooden Wonder. German pilots gave it darker nicknames: Der Teufel, aus Holz, the Devil of Wood. In briefing rooms, crews started to say it out loud with a half smile, half prayer. This was the plane that had forgotten how to die. Across the channel, in cold laboratories and hangars, the laughter that had greeted the idea of a wooden bomber had already stopped. The Mosquito was no longer a curiosity. It was a problem. One the Luftwaffe could neither catch nor ignore. And somewhere in Germany, orders were already being written to drag one of these wooden ghosts from the sky and cut it open to find out what, exactly, made it unstoppable. The order, when it finally came, was simple and ruthless. If the British could build a wooden bomber that laughed at German fighters, Germany would drag one from the sky and interrogate it splinter by splinter. The opportunity arrived in the spring of 1943. A Mosquito on reconnaissance over northern Germany flew into a storm of flak. Shrapnel tore through a wing. One engine coughed its last, and the pilot nursed the stricken aircraft across miles of gray countryside before crash landing in a marsh near Hamburg. Miraculously, the Mosquito did not burn. There was no twisted aluminum carcass, no melted metal puddles. When German troops reached the site, they found something that looked unsettlingly like the wreck of a large wooden boat. Smooth panels, pale and light enough for a man to lift, still smelled faintly of smoke and resin. It was less like an aircraft, more like a shattered piece of fine joinery. To the Luftwaffe's technical branch, it was the prize of the year. Every scrap that could be pried from the mud was carefully tagged and shipped to a secret analysis hangar near Rechlin, their main testing ground. Under cold, unwavering floodlights, the Mosquito was laid out on wooden trestles like a strange patient on an operating table. Engineers in white coats circled it with clipboards and scalpels. These were men raised on steel and rivets, on the glow of welding torches. Now they were confronted with sanding blocks, saws, and glue lines. Dr. Karl Heinz Henkel, the same man who had once rapped his knuckles in disbelief on a plywood panel, led the dissection. The first cuts were almost reverent. Thin strips of the outer skin came away to reveal layer upon layer beneath. The surface veneer was birch, just a few millimeters thick, but so uniform it seemed painted rather than grown. Beneath it lay a honeycomb of balsa wood, so light it could rest on a palm like a feather, yet when bonded in place, remarkably stiff. Then another birch layer below that. It was as if the British had grown an airframe from a single tree. Henkel's team measured density, tensile strength, shear resistance, Each test strained their expectations more than the samples. The laminated composite could bear nearly twice the load of comparable aluminum panels at roughly half the weight. It resisted moisture, shrugged off vibration, and tolerated heat far better than any wooden structure had a right to. When a technician tried to separate two bonded panels with a hydraulic press, the wood itself cracked and splintered, but the adhesive lines remained unbroken, pale veins running through shattered grain. Germany had used casing glue, milk-based, cheap, familiar in trainers and gliders for years. Everyone knew its flaws. In humidity and heat, it degraded, joints softened, and seams creaked. This British adhesive was something else entirely. Chemical analysis revealed a synthetic resin rooted in phenol and formaldehyde, cured under pressure into a hard, glassy polymer. Even when reheated, it did not soften, it toughened, turning the layered wood into a single, unified material. It was, in essence, invisible armor grown inside the mosquito's skin. Henkel's frustration tasted almost like envy. Germany's chemical industry had once led the world. It produced synthetic fuel, rubber, dyes, marvels that fed the Reich's war machine. Yet here, in this humble, sticky domain of glue, they had been outthought. They could, perhaps, recreate the formula on paper. But there was a brutal obstacle: resources. Phenolic resins demanded phenol and methanol from coal, the same coal already consumed by explosives and fuel. Even if they stole the recipe, they could not make it in the quantities needed. As they worked, the Mosquito revealed another layer of brilliance. The fuselage halves were clearly molded over huge forms, then joined down the centerline, forming an airtight shell without an internal cage of metal spars. It was smoother, lighter, and stronger than any riveted skin they knew. One of Henkel's young assistants, Vogel, stared at a cross-section of the wing through a magnifier. "It looks alive," he said softly. The glue lines curved like the veins of a leaf. Henkel could not disagree. When he later demonstrated his findings to senior officers, he placed two samples on the table, a strip of aluminum and a strip of laminated birch, bonded with British resin. He bent the metal. It deformed and stayed bent, a permanent scar. He flexed the wood. It sprang back. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "we have been building the wrong kind of strength." The room fell silent. Somewhere in that silence hung the bitter realization that the British had done more than build a fast bomber. They had turned their shortages of metal, of factories, of time into an advantage, and transformed carpentry into a weapon the Reich could not easily copy. The reports from Rechlin landed on the desks of the Luftwaffe's high command like an insult. A British bomber built from plywood and glue was outrunning, outclimbing, and outwitting the Reich's finest metal machines. For men who had built their careers on precision metallurgy, it was more than a military setback. It was a wound to their pride. The response from above was swift and predictable. If the British could do it, then Germany would do it better. The project was given a name that sounded like a sneer: Mücke the gnat, a tiny insect meant to sting the British mosquito. On paper, the idea radiated confidence. German engineers would capture the essence of the mosquito, strip it down to its equations, and rebuild it as a faster, stronger, deadlier hunter. The assignment went to a team at the Luftwaffe Forschungsanstalt in Braunschweig, who began with fragments and measurements painstakingly gathered by Henkel's team. Yet from the first sketches, the numbers betrayed them. Where the British had used lightweight Ecuadorian balsa, Germany had none. The blockade had closed that door. In its place came pine and beech, harder, denser, available, but unforgiving. A mosquito wing section that weighed about 280 kilograms swelled to over 400 inches, the Mücke prototype. Every substitution added weight. Every attempt to shave it back threatened structural integrity. The Mücke was becoming a caricature of the original, familiar in outline, clumsy in substance. The glue told the same story. Without reliable supplies of phenolic resin, the team fell back on what they knew: casein adhesives tweaked with formalin in a desperate attempt to slow their decay in damp and heat. On a bench, in a lab, under ideal conditions, the joints looked acceptable. But every engineer in the room understood the quiet danger. Casein glue did not like moisture, and aviation was nothing but moisture, vibration, and stress. Still, the war machine demanded progress, and propaganda demanded proof. Henkel's cautious warnings were massaged, softened, rewritten before they climbed the chain of command. Production orders were issued to furniture factories in Dresden and Kassel, the same kind of workshops the British had turned into unlikely war plants. But the conditions were brutally different. Air raids shattered roofs, power failed, trained workers were conscripted or killed. The Mosquito had been born from creativity. The Mücke was born from exhaustion. By late 1943, the first prototype stood ready under hangar lights. From a distance, it looked convincing. Twin engines, smooth fuselage, familiar lines that echoed its British rival. The test pilot Hauptmann Ernst Kessler climbed into the cockpit, ran through his checks, and rolled down the runway. At first, the Mücke seemed willing enough, lifting into the air and clawing for altitude. Then came the vibration. At 350 miles per hour, the wings started to hum, a low, unsettling resonance that climbed into a groan. The laminated layers flexed out of phase. The pilot felt the airframe shudder. Thin cracks crept along the leading edges. Kessler throttled back and forced a landing. The undercarriage collapsed, the aircraft skidding to an ugly halt. Inspection was a catalogue of everything Henkel had feared. Moisture had seeped into glue lines, softening just enough to allow tiny shifts in shape. The wing's perfect airfoil had warped by millimeters, but in high-speed flight, millimeters were fatal. The second prototype tried to correct the sins of the first: more bracing, more weight, slightly altered glue mixtures. It flew heavier, slower, more reluctant. On paper, it reached around 360 miles per hour, respectable for a bomber, but nowhere near the Mosquito's ghostly pace. The third never came home. In a low-altitude dive test, the Mücke shook itself apart. The wooden layers peeled away in flight, the wing delaminating with a sickening rip. Investigators tried to blame Kessler's inputs, the weather, anything but the truth written in splinters. By 1944, the project was quietly killed. What remained were binders of data, laced with a tone rare in German technical writing: despair. One memo admitted bluntly that the design cannot achieve parity with British construction due to fundamental material limitations. In the margin of a test report, someone had scrawled a line that engineers repeated in private: "We are fighting physics with paperwork." No one wanted to tell Göring. When he finally heard that the Mücke had failed, his rage exploded. He smashed an ashtray against a wall and spat out a sentence that hung over every laboratory and factory: "We are defeated by carpenters." In his journal that autumn, Henkel wrote the verdict he could never submit officially: "We have machines without imagination. They have imagination without machines." The Mosquito had exposed a crack in the Reich's identity. It was not just about wood and glue. It was about a system too rigid to bend, trying to imitate a machine built on the courage to break its own rules. By 1944, the Mosquito was no longer just an aircraft on operational charts. It had become a presence, a rumor with wings. It slipped across the night skies of Europe like a whispered story here, One moment, gone the next, leaving only craters and questions behind. For the men watching radar screens in darkened Luftwaffe bunkers, its appearance was a particular kind of dread. The faint, fast-moving blip that rose, flickered, and vanished before they could vector fighters onto it had a name they hated to say aloud: Mosquito. Interceptor pilots gave it nicknames that were half resentment, half grudging respect. Düsterjäger, the shadow hunter. Some simply called it the ghost. On the ground, German troops learned to recognize the low-taut whine of its merlins in the early hours of dawn. If a mosquito could reach you, the old assumption that anything was truly safe had already died. The numbers painted a picture that almost defied belief. Heavy bombers like the Lancaster paid for each mission in blood. Loss rates of 5, 6, even 7% were grimly accepted. For the Mosquito, the rate hovered below 1%. One aircraft lost for every 200 sorties. That meant Mosquito crews could fly again and again, while their comrades in slower, armored bombers lived under the shadow of statistics that whispered they would not see the war's end. Raf Witz joked that flying a Mosquito was safer than crossing Piccadilly after dark. Behind the humor lay a startling truth. The unarmed wooden bomber was the most survivable offensive machine in the Royal Air Force. Inside Germany, disbelief curdled into humiliation. Every intelligence report that crossed Hermann Göring's desk, bearing the word Mosquito, was another twist of the knife. He had once promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe would rule the skies, that enemy bombers would be swatted down in droves. Now, British aircraft, many of them made of wood, were appearing over Berlin in broad daylight. The Mosquitoes seemed to time its visits with theatrical cruelty. On one January day in 1943, as Göring prepared to deliver a radio address, Mosquitoes roared in to drop bombs on Berlin, rattling windows and egos simultaneously. In January 1944, they repeated the insult during another important event. Both times, they escaped untouched. Göring is said to have growled, "I turn green with envy when I see those wooden aircraft flying over Berlin." Even he had to admit what his fighters and flak could not change. Our aircraft can't catch them. As the war dragged into its final ragged chapters, the Luftwaffe aged while the Mosquito somehow stayed young. Germany's best pilots died faster than they could be replaced, and their successors were rushed through training, thrown into cockpits with too few hours and too many enemies. Against slow bombers, they could still fight. Against mosquitoes, they chased shadows. Conventional bombers followed predictable routes and altitudes, forming big, trackable streams. The Mosquito refused every pattern. It came alone, or in pairs, skimming treetops, popping up out of valleys, then vanishing into cloud. By the time radar found it, it was already leaving. At Peenemünde and Rechlin, engineers sketched desperate answers, faster variants of the Focke-Wulf 190, specialized high-altitude fighters, and finally the jet-powered Me 262, all were touted as mosquito killers. On paper, the jets could outpace the wooden bomber. In practice, they were temperamental prima donnas. They needed long, smooth runways, carefully husbanded fuel, gentle handling, and endless maintenance. The Mosquito needed a strip of grass, 2 merlins, and 2 men willing to skim the treetops at impossible speed. For German civilians, the Mosquito became a psychological weapon that struck far beyond the weight of its bombs. Its raids targeted railway junctions, Gestapo offices, communication centers, nodes of control rather than sheer tonnage. In Copenhagen and Oslo, each sudden appearance of the wooden wonder became a quiet promise to the resistance. You are not forgotten. In Berlin, rumors spread that the British had built a plane invisible to radar. The Mosquito's roar, brief and vanishing, became the sound of inevitability. The RAF understood this and wielded the aircraft like a scalpel. When heavy bombers set out to burn cities at night, Mosquitoes went ahead, marking targets with flares and incendiaries with uncanny precision. When the big formations turned for home, Mosquitoes often returned later to hit rescue crews, key headquarters, and control centers. Even a single Mosquito sortie could force the Luftwaffe to scramble entire squadrons, burning precious fuel and exhausting pilots in futile chases. The ghost dictated the enemy's movements simply by being rumored in the area. In the command centers of the Reich, the very name Mosquito could sour a briefing. Reports of sightings drew sighs rather than fresh plans. Everyone knew the pattern. By the time the phone rang or the radar lit up, the wooden ghost had already done its work and gone. The Luftwaffe still flew, but its morale had been hollowed from the inside. For many, the Mosquito was no longer an aircraft. It was a verdict on their systems, their doctrine, and their pride. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the Mosquito had already crossed the line from weapon to legend. It had flown more than 80,000 combat sorties, photography, low-level bombing, night fighting, pathfinding with losses so small that statisticians checked their sums twice. In shattered hangars across Europe, amid twisted metal wrecks of once proud bombers, the Mosquito's sleek wooden fuselage looked like something from another story entirely. Too smooth, too elegant, almost indecently undamaged by the chaos that had created it. Germany lay in ruins, its cities scarred by the heavy bombers that Mosquitoes had guided with eerie accuracy. Yet when surviving, German engineers spoke of the aircraft that had impressed them most. It was not the hulking B-17 seconds or Lancasters they mentioned first. It was the wooden ghost that had humiliated their science. In the months after the surrender, Allied inspection teams invited captured German specialists to tour factories they had only known through reconnaissance photos. Among the visitors to de Havilland's plant at Hatfield was Dr. Karl-Heinz Henkel. He walked slowly through the assembly halls, past great wooden molds and half-finished fuselage halves, glowing under work lamps. The air was thick once again with a sharp sweet smell of resin, the same scent that had clung to his coat in that hangar near Hamburg. He watched as craftsmen in overalls stroked their hands along curved panels, checking for flaws by feel, not just by gauge. Engineers stood beside them, not above them, discussing tolerances with men whose fathers had built pianos and violins. Henkel turned to his young British escort and asked, almost incredulous, how many men designed this process? Not many, the engineer replied with a small, tired smile. But thousands built it. The answer stayed with Henkel. In his post-war reports for the new German aviation authorities, he wrote that the Mosquito's true secret was not a single formula or aerodynamic trick, but culture. Britain had allowed chemists, carpenters, model makers, and mathematicians to share the same table. A violin maker could talk about resonance with an airframe designer. A furniture worker could suggest how to clamp a fuselage half more cleanly. Where German factories had been ruled by hierarchy and fear of failure, the Mosquito had been born in a space where improvisation could breathe. The technical legacy spread quickly. Engineers in Britain, America, and even the defeated Germany began experimenting with new laminates and resins, fiberglass, honeycomb structures, and, later, carbon fiber composites, all traced a thin, resin-scented line back to the Mosquito's wooden skin. What had been born from shortage, no aluminum, not enough metal factories, became the foundation of a new age of abundance in aerospace design. Boeing engineers will later call the Mosquito the ancestor of every composite airframe that followed. The RAF kept Mosquitoes in service well into the 1,950 seconds, long after jets had scratched their white lines across the sky. Pilots still volunteered for the old wooden wonder. They loved its responsiveness, its quiet confidence. One veteran said, "It felt like the airplane wanted to live as much as you did." To the men who had flown it through flak and fire, it was more than wood and glue. It was proof that an idea could be braver than armor. For Geoffrey de Havilland, the Mosquito was vindication in its purest form. The proposal they had once laughed at, the bomber, with no guns, no armor, made of wood, had not only worked, it had changed what engineering meant. He later remarked, "We were never trying to outmuscle the enemy. We were trying to outthink him." Those words became a quiet motto for generations of designers who followed. Time sanded down the edges of the war, but the Mosquito's lesson remained sharp. Progress does not always come from having more metal, more fuel, more factories. Sometimes it comes from desperation and the courage to look at something ordinary, plywood and glue, and see a miracle waiting inside it. Today, when you stand in front of a Mosquito in a museum, its varnished surface still gleams softly under the lights. If you lean close enough, you can almost imagine you smell the ghost of that resin, hear the faint echo of merlins and distant flak. Modern airliners rise on composite wings. Spacecraft ride to orbit wrapped in resin and fiber, all descendants of that unlikely wooden bomber. The men who built the Mosquito are gone now. Their names are scattered across old payrolls, squadron rosters, and fading photographs. But their idea is still alive every time something impossible takes flight. They proved that technology is not born from comfort, but from courage, the courage to build what everyone else calls absurd. So the next time you see a photograph of a Mosquito, slender, smooth, and silent, remember what it truly represented. Not just British ingenuity, not just wartime necessity, but the moment when imagination outran fear. If you believe true strength lies in daring to dream beyond logic, comment as shown below. And if you think the world still underestimates the power of human creativity, leave a like and subscribe for more untold stories that show how even wood and glue can change an industry and history.